Welcome to Road to Recovery's monthly species working group webinar series. I'm Quinn Carvey. I'm the graduate fellow with Road to Recovery. Paul is unable to be on the call today, so I'm stepping in to deliver our opening remarks. We just have a few announcements before we begin the webinar. So we do have simultaneous translation in Spanish. So to enable your preferred language, you can click on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and then select either English or Spanish. We've also posted the instructions in the chat, so hopefully you can enable the language preference of your choice. And thanks again to Belen for your amazing translation services for this series. Yesterday, we had our third engagement session on the topic of private lands. This webinar focused on conserving birds on U.S. state lands. So if that's a topic that was of interest to you and you want to either revisit or you weren't able to attend, that will be posted to our website soon. So stay tuned for those recordings. They'll be available on our website. I also wanted to let you know that our next species working group forum will be happening probably in mid to late January. So just keep an eye out on your email for more information on the upcoming forum if that's been useful to you in the past. All right, so now we'll move on to the main event. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Jeff Walters, who will be giving a talk about the red-cockaded woodpecker. Jeffrey R. Walters is a Harold Bailey Professor of Biological Sciences at Virginia Tech, a position he has held since 1994. He holds a BA from West Virginia University and a PhD from the University of Chicago. He has spent 1 year as an NSF postdoc at Berkeley, then joined the zoology faculty at North Carolina State University, where he spent 13 years, moving through the ranks from assistant to associate to full professor before moving to Virginia Tech. His research interests are in the behavioral ecology, population biology, and conservation of birds, including work on cooperative breeding systems, effects of habitat fragmentation, dispersal behavior, cavity nesting bird communities, and several endangered species. Dr. Walters has studied the red-cockaded woodpecker for more than 40 years. He is active in avian conservation as the current chair of the AOS Conservation Committee, the AOS representative to NABC, and an R2R core team member, and has served on numerous panels that provided independent reviews of relevant science related to issues in avian conservation. So thank you so much, Jeff, for giving today's talk, and I'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Quinn, and good afternoon to everyone that's here on the webinar. I'm going to talk about the recovery of the red-cockaded woodpecker, which was just over a month ago downlisted from endangered to threatened. And it's very much going to be my personal history with the recovery of this bird. And looking back, I can see that I basically followed the Road to Recovery vision for addressing population declines of avian species, but by accident, just making decisions along the way about what the best thing to do was. So I call it a meandering, stumbling way of applying the Road to Recovery vision. You'll see that as what I mean by that as I go through. Okay, I'm having trouble like moving the slides for some reason. There we go. So these are the 3 points of the Road to Recovery approach for reversing declines of bird populations. First, figuring out what the population linkages and limiting factors causing the bird declines are. And then second, creating targeted conservation actions. And then third, applying co-produced implementation of conservation. So I'll talk about these 3 steps and how they came about with my work with red-cockaded woodpeckers. And another theme of this talk is going to be just the value of basic research in avian conservation, research that may not seem to have a conservation application at first. But I'll argue that that's often where breakthroughs and paradigm shifts in management come from. So the red-cockaded woodpecker is an endangered bird. It's a cooperatively breeding bird. It's unique in making its cavities in living pine trees, as you see on the right there. And it's strongly linked to the longleaf pine ecosystem. The problems that led to its decline in the first place was, first of all, it was probably the most common woodpecker in the southeastern United States originally. but a lot of its habitat was lost. The coastal plain and up into the Piedmont of the southeast used to be covered in longleaf pine, but those forests were cut over at the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s, such that of the area that originally was covered by longleaf, only about 3% of it remains. So 97% of its prime habitat was eliminated. And then there was habitat degradation that goes along with that. Loss of old growth, longleaf lived to be over 400 years old sometimes. And when the forests were cut over, most of those old trees, of course, disappeared. There were few that were left behind because of what was known as the naval stores industry. Longleaf pine was critical to the era of wooden ships. They used the trunks for masts, and they used the various products they made from pine resin, which they bled from the trees for things on these old wooden ships. And what they would do is they would make cuts into the pine and bleed the resin from that and collect it. And then they would move up a little bit higher the next couple of years to get more resin. And they left these big scars in the trees. So when timber cutters came through, they left those trees. So we still had a few old trees left around, but not many. We ended up with a much younger second growth forest. More recently, another form of habitat degradation was fire suppression. Longleaf is a fire maintained system. In the upper right there, you see what longleaf looks like with frequent fire and lots of plants on the ground, a lot of plant diversity, very open. People used to talk about being able to see from horizon to horizon, riding their horses through longleaf pine. You also see a fire there in the lower right. Not exactly infernos. These are ground fires that move across the ground, burn up the ground cover, don't really damage the canopy trees. And then in the middle there, you see what longleaf pine looks like if you suppress fire. So you get these small hardwoods, mostly oak species that grow up. Their role in the system, they're a natural part of the system. Their role is to grow up very, very quickly in areas that escape fire. The fire goes around for quite a few years. But if you don't burn it all, then you get a continuous, dense mid-story of these pines, and you see that of these oaks. You can barely see from one pine to another. You get a lot of leaf litter on the ground, not so much plants anymore. So a very different system. And as I'll discuss later, this is not a good thing for red-cockaded woodpeckers either. So Smokey the Bear, red-cockaded woodpecker is not a fan of Smokey the Bear. There's about 50 years of fire suppression that did a lot of damage to this system. So I started working on red-cockaded woodpeckers by joining a project that had just gotten underway. I joined it in 1983. It had started in 1980. It was started by a colleague of mine, Phil Dorr, in my department at North Carolina State University, and his graduate student, Jay Carter. And you see Jay there on the upper right looking into a red-cockaded woodpecker cavity. And Jay and Phil were mostly interested in the recovery of the bird, the conservation of the bird. My role when I joined the study was the basic research side, studying the cooperative breeding system, because I was very interested in cooperative breeding. This is a system that doesn't look very diverse if you see it there on the left, but it's actually the most, in terms of plant diversity, the most diverse system in the temperate zone in the world. But most of that diversity is on the ground, lots of insectivorous plants. You see an Anderson's tree frog on the lip of a pitcher plant in the lower right. That's the first thing I ever saw. The first day I went out into longleaf pine for the first time ever in my life. And I stepped out of the car at our first stop. I was going with Jay, and the first thing I saw right beside me was that, and I took a picture of that. So I was kind of hooked very quickly. I thought, this is really, really cool. Little did I know I'd be working on it still all these years later. So what attracted me to this study was, and it's now in its 45th breeding season, was its scale. Very, very large study area, 110,000 hectares. You see the map there. It has a lot of different kinds of land. Fort Bragg is a military base, and the western third of it is part of our study area. Sopi, Moore, Minor, those are all referred to some private land. So it's got private land, federal land, which is Department of Defense, and then SGLA there On the side is the game lands run by the state, so also some state property. Multiple landowners. You can see the picture of a golf course. A lot of the private land has golf courses on it. There are woodpeckers along the golf courses on the military base there in the lower right. And just to give you an example of the scale in terms of numbers of birds, they live in family groups. In 2023, we were monitoring 370 family groups and comprised of 1,092 adults, and they fledged 538 young. Our core data, we do a complete annual census of the color banded population. We color band all the birds, so we, record survival, changes in status. As you'll see, we have helpers, which are young birds that stay at home as adults, helping their parents, the breeders, or other relatives. So we look at who's a helper, who's a floater, who's not either, who's a helper, who's a breeder, who's a floater. Those will come up in a little bit. We track dispersal of birds. We get reproductive data, clutch size, what happens to nests, and we color band all the nestlings. So we look at fledgling success and stuff like that. Here you see a couple of the nestlings. They hatch asynchronously, so they're usually different sizes. So you might think, well, yeah, he says he monitors 370 groups, but how in the world could you do that and know that you have the whole population? It's ironic, given that they're endangered species, but they're really, really easy to monitor, and that's because of their cavity trees. Our detection rate in terms of adults we see in a particular year is always over 95%, usually around 98%. We miss a few that we don't see in one year and then see in the next, but very, very few. For one thing, the cavity trees in these live pines are very, very easy to see because the birds peck into the sapwood. Again, they're in living pine trees all around the cavity and make resin flow, and it makes this white sticky stuff. And they'll use the same tree for years. And the one in the upper right, you see that's a tree that's been used for many, many years, and it looks like a candlestick out in the woods. It's got so much dried sap on it. And also they occur in clusters, these cavity trees, and individual trees, easy to spot. But the family has a whole set of them, which we call a cavity tree cluster, because every adult has its own cavity that it roosts in at night. And then they breed in one of those cavities during the breeding season. And then they have cavities that are old cavities not using right now, but you can still see them. And they have cavities that they're working on that aren't finished yet. And those cavity tree clusters can be used for decades. They're still, I started in 1983, there are still cavity trees in the exact same spots in many, many instances. So it's easy to keep track of all of them and know that you're not missing anybody. You could never do this with a downy woodpecker or hairy woodpecker on this scale. So when I started, the red-cockaded woodpecker was in lots of trouble. The lower left there, you see a study that was put out around that time by the Forest Service, what their populations were doing. And the blue is ones that had recently gone extinct. The green is ones that were declining rapidly. The red's ones that were declining, but not too rapidly. And the white, the ones that were stable. There was not a single increasing population at that time. We had fire suppression going on, so the ecosystem was in bad shape. Lack of old growth as well. And management was failing. The management plan at that time was to set aside basically 10 out of every 150 acres and protect the old trees in that and hope the birds would move in to increase their numbers. They never had those were called recruitment stands. They never had a single one, probably 4,000 of them set up, never had a single one occupied. So nothing positive was happening, only negative. So the first principle for the road to recovery vision is understanding what the limiting factors are. Clearly, those were unknown at that time. There wasn't any new habitat loss to speak of going on. There wasn't much cutting of old trees going on, so it didn't seem to be a carrying capacity that they were losing habitat. Also, their vital rates, their productivity, and their survival rates weren't consistent with the population decline. They were the same whether the population was stable or declining. They were the same in protected and unprotected areas. If you put them together in a model, it looked like the population should be doing fine, but they weren't. There was also no link of fire suppression to vital rates. Nobody understood how that could be affecting vital rates. So the whole thing didn't make much sense compared to like other endangered species that everybody knows about, like bald eagles, where we had DDT affecting thinning eggshells, so their productivity went way down. They weren't producing enough young. Populations went down. Condors were being poisoned by lead, so their survival rates were way too low. They were going down. California gnatcatchers, another example with this one carrying capacity. Their habitat they lived in was prime real estate, so they were constantly losing habitat. That's why their populations were going down. But red-cockaded woodpeckers, it just wasn't clear why they were declining, what the limiting factors were. So again, I joined to study the cooperative breeding system. And originally, the question I wanted to ask was whether staying at home as a helper and helping relatives raise young rather than producing your own was a selfish thing or an altruistic thing. There was a lot of interest. This is the early days of behavioral ecology in the evolutionary basis of cooperative breeding. What could select for individuals doing this seemingly altruistic behavior? Was there an explanation of it? And this was a good system to study that question because, again, lots of demographic data, big scale for the study, so you could get a lot of demographic data, which is what you needed. And also, both staying and not staying were common in red-cockaded woodpeckers. This shows what happens to fledglings by age 1. Almost half of them, this is for males, almost half of them will have died by age 1, but 30% will have remained on their natal territory as a helper, but 20% will have left in their first year, and they might become a floater. They might actually get a breeding position. They might become what we call a solitary male. They get a territory but don't have a mate, or they might join another group as a helper. So you could directly compare what happens to the ones that leave in the first year versus what happens to the ones that stay at home and see what their lifetime fitness looks like. So that's what we did with the first study. And what we found, now I should also point out first that it's not like helpers stay at home forever. They also become breeders. This shows like what happens to a helper from one year to the next. Fairly low mortality rate. A lot of them, almost half, remain as a helper for another year. But a third of them get a breeding territory or they leave. So they get it either by inheriting the breeding position on the territory where they're staying as a helper, or they move to a nearby territory, another territory in the neighborhood. They don't go very far when they disperse, helpers don't, and they maybe become a breeder that way. So again, this is the male graph. Similar graphs for females. Females cannot inherit their natal territory, basically, unless everybody else dies, just because of the way incest avoidance works in this species, but they can disperse. So they can stay as helpers and then disperse to become breeders. They don't stay as much as the males do. They're more likely to disperse compared to males, but you could also follow them through their lifetimes with the two strategies. And you don't have to look at all the things on this graph. It just shows like, we looked at things like what's their probability they will become a breeder, how many years do they breed, how many young fledglings do they produce per year when they do breeding. And basically what we found out is staying is selfish. The birds that stay as helpers end up doing better in terms of lifetime fitness in the long run, even though they delay breeding, than the ones that disperse in their first year. And this seems to be because they end up with the best territories. Basically, they're sitting and waiting to get a good territory. And that's why they're staying, why they actually help instead of just kind of being lazy and not doing any work, hanging around in the territory, but not doing anything. That does seem to be due to kin selection, that what they get out of that is raising relatives other than their own offspring. So copies of their own genes in siblings or half siblings or nephews, things like that. Okay, so some implications for population dynamics right away. If you think about it, in this species, productivity and mortality don't affect the number of breeders because you have these two classes of non-breeders that are adults, helpers and floaters, that can immediately fill a breeding position. So what happens if you have a year of low productivity, you don't get as many individuals going into that helper class, but the number of breeders is unaffected. If you have a lot of breeding mortality, you have a lot of helpers and floaters moving into those breeding positions. They fill them all. So the helper class goes down. but the number of breeders doesn't. If you have a really high level of productivity, you just end up with more helpers and floaters the next year. So helpers and floaters, especially helpers, stabilize red-cockaded woodpecker populations. They're basically a buffer between mortality and productivity and breeding population size. But this actually makes the decline in the population, which is measured in the declines in the number of breeders, more puzzling, not less. They should be more stable. They shouldn't be declining. So again, still not understanding population dynamics and what the limiting factors are. And to get to that, I have to say a little bit more about cavity excavation. Longleaf pine is their favorite because it produces the most resin, which they like. To make a cavity in a longleaf pine or any pine, you have to have an old tree because the amount of heartwood, which is where the cavity chamber has to be, is a function of age. And only older trees, in a longleaf pine, it's usually 100 years or older, have enough heartwood to have a cavity chamber. They have to excavate through the sapwood to get into that. And that's tricky to do because as soon as they start excavating through it, sap leaks into the tunnel that they're making and they can't go in there anymore. They'll get trapped in the sap and die. So it's intermittent. They only excavate when they're going through the sapwood in the summer months when resin flows more quickly, presumably because they can detect it. They'll excavate a little, leave it, come back next year, 2 years later, do a little more, leave it. And the bottom line is they're also introducing fungi, it turns out, when they go in there that help them rot the heartwood eventually when they get in there. So there's a mutualism with fungi going on. But the bottom line, it takes them a long time to make a cavity. When we first measured this, it was 13 years on average to make a cavity in a longleaf pine tree. Whereas a typical woodpecker, red-bellied woodpecker, downy woodpecker can make a cavity in days to weeks. So, and one little digression here, why do they like the resin? Because they maintain resin wells. And you can see them on the left there. These are places where they chip into the sapwood and they do it every day. And you can see sap flows down from those resin wells and it makes a barrier of sap around their cavity. And they do that to protect the cavities from snakes. Because a snake like a rat snake, a black rat snake, can move up a living pine tree about as fast as they can go along the ground. And what they do is they wedge their ventral scales into the bark and kind of grip that way and climb the tree. And what happens with the resin is they get beads of resin in those scales and then they can't grip. And you see them writhe around for a while, and then they fall off the tree and they have to rub all that off before they can climb anything. So the resin protects them from snakes. Okay, now to get to limiting factors, we wanted to study the next step in understanding the evolution of cooperative breeding, which is why. Why does staying pay? The demography works out, but what about the ecology of the red-cockaded woodpecker makes it work out for them to stay at home for a while when all the other birds around them aren't doing that? And the ideas in those days, the concepts, explanation of this were called habitat saturation or benefits of philopatry. It's basically the idea if you have high spatial variation in territory quality, but very little temporal variation. In other words, if territory A is better than B in 1 year, it's also better the next year and the next year. That selects for staying at home. That selects for trying to get one of these high quality territories and then staying as a means to acquire a high quality territory. And the implications for what we thought made a high quality territory was the presence of a cluster of cavity trees. In other words, if you could get an area of habitat that already had a cavity tree cluster, you were in business right away. Whereas if you moved into unoccupied space, you had to start one, and that's a lower quality territory. So you're better off waiting for to be able to take over a cluster of cavities than going out and making them on your own. So the implications for the red-cockaded woodpecker of that was that they had a carrying capacity issue, but an unusual one. It wasn't habitat per se, but it was cavities within the habitat. So maybe the reason for the decline was that they were losing cavities and thus losing high quality territories, which they were abandoning. And that's why populations were going down. So we thought of cavity tree clusters as the carrying capacity for the bird, the number of cavity clusters, the carrying capacity for the breeding population. That was our idea. So we came out with a new management paradigm based on that, which was to to make cavities for the birds in unoccupied territory. We called those recruitment clusters, unoccupied habitat. And if we were right, they should move in and form new groups because now we've turned a low quality space into a high quality space. Also, what we called cavity management, protect existing cavities. Because if you lose all the cavities or most of them on an existing territory, then that territory becomes low quality and they'll abandon it. Other parts of it, you have to use prescribed fire to restore and maintain the habitat. I'll get back to that in a minute. But also just leave the other things that use our cavities alone. People were killing flying squirrels at really high rates at this time because they would get in red-cockaded woodpecker cavities, but they didn't really hurt them. So basically, everything is focused on cavities. And why prescribed fire is important? First of all, it maintains the ecosystem, maintains foraging habitat. You get these growing season fires, mostly caused by lightning, go along the ground. Really important to the ecosystem, and that's what creates the high plant diversity. But for the red-cockaded woodpecker, what happens if you get this layer of hardwoods and they get up to the level of the cavity, the birds will abandon the cavity. So that links fire suppression to loss of cavities as well. And presumably this is because snakes can climb up the hardwoods and then get over to the cavity and get in there and eat the adults or eat the nest if they have hardwoods around it. So they just abandon those cavities. So we think we thought at this point we'd found out the reason, what the limiting factors were. So what we then decided to do was create targeted conservation actions, basically doing what the number 2 step in road to recovery is. And the new management paradigm, which based out of basic research, studies of cooperative breeding. It didn't originally start out as a conservation kind of study. Suggested all these conservation actions with recruitment clusters being the key one. But what are we missing? We're missing co-production. We're just out there doing our research and pitching ideas to people. And this idea was not well received at all. The timing was coincident with the advent of conservation biology in the late 1980s, which created a lot of friction. Actually, it was kind of ecologists coming out of their ivory towers, at least it was viewed this way by some, into the field of wildlife management, which of course already had people who were wildlife managers in it and kind of telling them what to do. So there was a lot of friction between the management community and the newly created field of conservation biology. Having a degree from University of Chicago, I was viewed as one of these ivory tower people. So nobody was too interested in taking this seriously, our ideas seriously. So we ended up having to go back to NSF, get money to try out our recruitment cluster idea. We didn't experiment. A graduate student of mine, Carol Copion, invented a way to make a cavity in a pine tree, go up on a power drill, stand on top of a ladder. What could go wrong with that, right? And we did this experiment where we picked out 40 sites of 150 acres each. And 20 of them we didn't do anything to. The other 2, we put 2 cavities that we made and 3 starts, which are just the entrance tunnel into the heartwood to get them past that stage. It takes a long time. And we got 19 out of 20 occupied and 0 out of 20 for controls. And at the time, that was the largest increase in a red-cockaded woodpecker population ever seen. 19 new groups in 2 years, basically. So now that worked, but again, no co-production, not really working with people at this point still. And the late 1980s into the early 1990s, when we did this experiment, was a time of intense controversy about red-cockaded woodpeckers. It's called the Woodpecker Wars. They were a southeastern version of the South Spotted Owl, same kind of conflicts with property rights. People thought they were going to ruin their property values if the woodpeckers came on their land. They'd be restricted in what they could do on their property. If they had timber, they wouldn't be able to cut it. This was something called the Wise Use Movement, started for private lands, which was an initiative to sort of anti-RCW. On the military bases, they were viewed as getting in the way of military training and putting too many constraints on them. A senator from North Carolina tried to get our base that we were working on, Fort Bragg, exempted from the Endangered Species Act. because the center of all this was right where we were working, this North Carolina Sandhills. And the biggest one was timber harvest, like need old trees. We're going to put the loggers out of business. The spur's going to put the loggers out of business. Some economists did a study and showed that people were cutting their timber in North Carolina, not based on when the optimum was for its value, but how close they were to red-cockaded woodpeckers. In other words, if they were near red-cockaded woodpeckers, they were just clear cutting it because they thought they'd not be able to soon. They thought the birds would move on there and maybe their land wouldn't be worth much anymore. So very, very unpopular idea to try to increase red-cockaded woodpecker populations in the Sandhills particularly. So we couldn't apply the management paradigm there. We had moved to Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune in coastal North Carolina a couple years before and started working there. And there we had a good collaboration between the managers of the base, the military people running the base, us as the researchers, the natural resource people on the base, which were really, really good. And the military is very committed to trying to increase their populations. So we sort of just stumbled into co-production of a sense, working with the people, at least on this military base, not with the public really, but at least working with people with consensus and common ground, what we wanted to do. So we started there in 1991, applying the new management paradigm with recruitment clusters. And we had 27 groups then. We have 140 as of this year. So it worked really, really well there. You can also see the contrast. I should go back here. So on the coast of North Carolina there, the orange is Camp Lejeune. North of it is Croatan National Forest, that green. South of it is state land, Holly Shelter, the pink. And then straight to the west there, that's all that orange, red, and pink together. That's where the Sandhills are. But anyway, if you look at what happened in the other adjacent populations, we actually first started on Croatan National Forest. That's the lighter blue line. And you can see we started there a year before 90. That's where and they started going up. And then we got sort of kicked out of there around 1996, 97. And you could see once we left, even though both populations were going on, once we left, and they weren't doing recruitment clusters anymore, that they leveled off. And Lejeune kept going up. And then Holly Shelter, they had very, very small area, so they thought they could fit a few more in. They did that right away and then have stayed stable since. We went to Eglin Air Force Base next to show that this could be done on a large population. Same story. Started out there in 1994 with 217 of these territories with clusters of cavity trees. We're up to 561 out of 2024. And we're still working there. So that's another long-term study there. That population was declared recovered when they had 420 clusters some years ago now. So finally, we're moving into, at this point, we've shown that it works. It's been done on a couple places. And we finally got the co-production step number 3, going in the Sandhills. A lot of this is because of Robert Bonney and Michael Bean from Environmental Defense Fund, who invented this concept called Safe Harbor, this program called Safe Harbor, which helped the woodpeckers win the woodpecker wars, basically. They did this in 1995. The first place it was ever used was in the Sandhills and for red-cockaded woodpeckers specifically. And what this program is, if you're a private landowner and you sign up for it, if you have some family groups on your land already, you're responsible for protecting them, but you're not responsible for any new birds, any new families that move onto your property. That means if you don't have any and you sign up, birds can move on you and onto your property and you have no responsibility for them. That immediately ended the conflict on private land over woodpeckers and private land values. It had a huge impact on the human dimensions part of conservation in the Sandhills, not so much on the helping the woodpeckers with their own biology and recovery, but it made private landowners much more acceptable. And in fact, what's happened is a huge expansion of those birds on private lands in the Sandhills ever since. And then right after that, there was a conservation partnership that was formed in the late 90s, and everybody became part of that. Military people, state agency people, different stakeholders, people represented the towns in the areas, nonprofits like Nature Conservancy, managers, researchers, the public, everybody got involved. It's been really, really effective. Everybody put their agendas on the table so that people could work on integrating different kinds of land uses. And it really turned around the attitudes in the Sandhills, so much so that in 2019, when a minor league baseball team was moved to the Sandhills, to the town of Fayetteville, they took nominations for the name of the team, and Woodpeckers was one of the ones that people kept nominating. Then they had a vote for the top three, and Woodpeckers, for the Red-Cockaded Woodpeckers, won overwhelmingly. So now they're highly, highly popular, whereas they were very unpopular before. So that kind of completed the whole process in the Sandhills, and then nationwide, in the Southeast anyway. The Woodpecker Wars were over. The new management paradigm was proven effective. It became codified as policy in a new version of the recovery plan in 2003. Department of Defense embraced this because their reason for that was that they had an agreement that if all restrictions on military, if they could recover the birds on their base, then restrictions on military training would all go away. Some were going away anyway, because it was proven that they didn't bother. Some of the restrictions were unnecessary. They weren't a problem. Forest Service with their timber cutting was slower to go around, come along, and so was Fish and Wildlife Service on refuges, but they eventually did. All the states kind of signed up for their own safe harbor programs. The new paradigm was increasingly employed, and then a species status assessment was done at the end of this period to look at how they were doing. This is the team, mostly Fish and Wildlife people, and then myself and a postdoc, Stephanie DeMay, working with me. We're part of the team that wrote it. Then we had an advisory team of 17 scientists and managers from around the Southeast, which included people I collaborated with, people from Eglin Air Force Base, the Marine Base, and also Jay Carter, who was in on the start of this. And what we found when we looked at this was that of the populations, over 30 groups, over this period, 20-year period from 1998 to 2017, 72% of them were increasing populations over that period. Only 9% were declining. Most of those were on the small end. 6 populations had become recovered, including Eglin and the Sandhills. We actually have found a way to measure the impact and show the efficiency of the different management techniques like cavity management and recruitment clusters, and applied those to future populations to see how things would go. And the SSA ended up supporting downlisting the bird from endangered to threatened, but not delisting it. There were a lot of hiccups at the end, though, because the last stage was doing actual downlisting. Politics intervened in the middle of that. We didn't get to actually finish the species status assessment. We were a couple months from being finished with it, and when we were told we had to turn it in, that turned out to be because they'd already scheduled a meeting. Fish and Wildlife had to make a decision. They'd already decided, actually, that they were going to delist it. So they had this meeting, then they were going to delist it. That went up the chain to, mostly for political reasons, that went up the chain to headquarters of Fish and Wildlife. The lawyers there looked at it and said, no, you're not doing that. They'd had a FOIA request from Southern Environmental Law Center, and they were told they were going to be sued. And SELC had gotten hold of all these emails, basically saying we decided before, and we're just going through the SSA and everything else, just to make it look like we're making a good decision. And they skipped a lot of things. And when Fish and Wildlife loses in court in a case involving endangered species, it's not because they interpreted the biology wrong. It's usually because they didn't do the process of downlisting or delisting properly. So they had to go back to the drawing board. They changed from delisting to downlisting. They came out with an announcement that they were downlisting it in September 2020, so now 2.5 years later. But again, they were threatened with a lawsuit, so they backed off of that after the ceremony. And this was all about the 4D rule at this point, why they had to back off again. So the 4D rule refers to a section of the Endangered Species Act where you have to define, if you're moving a species from endangered to threatened, what the protection is going to be as a threatened species. And it used to be the default, if you didn't write a specific rule and articulate everything that was going to be the protection, part of the protection. The default was it doesn't change at all, same as endangered if you don't write a rule. That was changed during the Trump administration to where the default was no protection whatsoever. So now now you have to write a 4D rule. And the one they wrote for that 2020 downlisting was a disaster. So they, again, had to go back to the drawing board. And the problem is the conservation reliant status of the red-cockaded woodpecker. You can't just stop the management. You have to do prescribed burning forever, basically, to keep the ecosystem going. And you have to keep using artificial cavities and protecting cavities until the forest mature enough that the birds can excavate cavities at a higher rate. So they went back, came out with a much better 4D rule. It was downlisted in October of this year on the 24th, and the 4D rule came out on the 25th, and recovery was officially achieved. So the new rule is much better. We'll see how it plays out, how it's applied, but it's a good ending, finally, just this year. So just to wrap up here, another thing this illustrates is avian conservation can be successful. There's tons of success stories out there. At the last American Ornithologist Society meeting, there was a symposium about success stories in avian conservation. There are going to be more of those symposia in future years. So success is possible. Everybody shouldn't get too pessimistic. It's easy to get pessimistic when you look at that graph of how many birds have been lost. Also, this, I think, again, illustrates that the road to recovery model really works. And even if you don't have that strategy at the beginning, like I didn't, you kind of end up following that plan. It would have been nice to have that plan at the beginning instead of sort of meandering around and getting there eventually. And especially a lesson learned from this is the lack of co-production from the outset really delayed the process, made it much longer than it could have been. But I guess my final message to everybody is if you're involved in avian conservation, just get out there and get it done. And that's what I have. So any questions, happy to answer them.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff, for a really insightful presentation. What an amazing blend of both biology and social science, and such a long-running project where you can really know so much about the system. So that's really wonderful. We are opening up the floor to questions. You can feel free to post them in the chat or to raise your hand, and we have one now. Great. Go ahead, Katie.
Hi, good morning, and thank you so much for this long road. My question is regarding the innovative snag creation you were working in the pines, and I know you probably had some lessons learned from that. I'm really interested in applying this to Willamette Valley ponderosa. Are there any BMPs out there in terms of, yes, don't fall off ladders, but more than that, that you could recommend? And thank you.
Yes. So, and it'll probably be easier for you. Like the one lesson is working closely with the people whose land you want to do this on, so that they're really familiar with what the impacts are going to be. I think that was the biggest lesson I learned. I probably should have talked more with people when we were first doing this and had a closer relationship with the management community. I think those relationships are a lot better these days than they used to be. But back when I was first doing this in the 80s into the early 90s. So that would be one. And also just showing that it works, I think really, really helped us doing a small scale kind of experiment and just demonstrating to people that it works. They don't always buy your like scientific ideas and hypotheses, but if you can show them some results, that helps.
Great. Lauren?
Yes. Can you hear me okay? All right, perfect. Hi, Jeff. It's Lauren. Fabulous presentation as always. My question is centered around the last two slides that you talked about in regards to the downlisting. So specifically in regards to SELC, do they, from what you know, do they not support downlisting from endangered to threatened? I could see how delisting, of course, would be a problem, but do you know if they support the downlisting from endangered to threatened, or any more information you can provide on that?
Well, they didn't. They didn't the first two go arounds. They certainly didn't support delisting, and basically nobody supports delisting. The
Right.
SSA is pretty clear that you can't go to that point yet. I have not. I mean, I heard from them really, really quickly in 2020 how upset they were about the initial 4D rule. I haven't heard from them this time, so I think they're kind of in the wait and see. They're a little bit skeptical still, but because they're not convinced that managers will continue to do the things they've been doing for the last 20 years or so. But they are not upset like they were the first two times.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
We have a few questions in the chat. First, someone says that they're curious about their overwintering behavior. Do individuals use their breeding cavities for roosting in winter? What are their family dynamics like during that time?
That's a really good question. And they do some really interesting things. Yeah, every night they roost in a cavity all year round, and everybody has their own roost cavity. You cannot, it's apparently a law, you cannot have two RCWs in one cavity overnight. The only time there's ever more than one in a cavity is when there's a nest in there. But the other thing that's really interesting, so I used to work on primates, and they're kind of like primates. The whole family, they go around their territory in a group most of the time. And actually some of the fledglings, a lot of the fledglings will overwinter, even the ones that leave home, will overwinter with their family. So they will also have their own cavities and travel around with their family. And then they start foraying around, visiting other territories and coming back home in the sort of February, March into April. And then the ones that are going to leave during that period. So you have a lot of family members that spend the winter. And another interesting thing, it's also a clue that helping is a good strategy, is only one male out of a brood ever stays as a helper. Really rare to have two. So, and it's always the dominant one. So apparently if you're the dominant one, you get to stay. Number two only gets to stay if number one dies during the winter. So you can have, you could have 3 fledglings from that year, along with all the helpers and breeders, traveling around all winter together, and then some of them leaving as you get into spring. A few do leave early on, like in the fall, but a lot of them spend the winter of the fledglings.
Well, what interesting social behavior they have. We have another question asking if the creation of cavities damages the health of the pine at all since they enter the heartwood.
Also, another really, really good question. And it relates to why another reason they prefer longleaf. So it's not so much, the cavity definitely creates a weak point, and you get a lot of wind, hurricanes come by, trees will often snap at the cavity. That's not real common, but it can happen. So it's definitely a weak point. The other thing is the resin wells. So the tree treats the pecking, making these resin wells, as an attack on the tree, as like an insect attack. So they actually ramp up their resin production when the red-cockaded woodpeckers are doing this from their normal baseline. And other pine trees, like a loblolly pine, it will do the same thing. They make cavities in them sometimes. It will ramp up its resin production, but it cannot keep it up for very long. So after 6 or 7 years, they kind of collapses and their resin production goes below baseline, and then they're actually vulnerable to insect attacks. But the people who have done these studies and kept watching these trees for years sort of gave up on longleaf pine. They seem to be able to do it like 20 years, and they still haven't stopped at all, gone down at all. They're still pumping out resin. Why keep going? So they seem to be able to keep it up forever. And they are known as the stickiest of all the southern pines. And I've seen insects that tried to burrow in end up on a long tube of resin that's sticking out from the tree with the insect stuck on the end of it. They're really good at defending themselves. So it does put an energy expense on the tree, but longleaf doesn't seem to be a problem. Other pines, it does weaken them. in the long run.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah, one other thing I'll say, and people don't believe me when I say this, like how in the world did they ever evolve this? But if there's a small pine growing up near the cavity tree and the branches touch the big pine, they will put resin wells on the small pine down around the trunk. Like, how do they know to do that? I don't know.
Wow, that's
Yeah,
amazing.
it's amazing.
Have another question asking if you can explain a little more about what you meant when you said new woodpeckers, if new woodpeckers moved onto private land, they weren't responsible for them. You said that helped turn things around with private landowners.
Right. So as an endangered species, there were certain protections on private land that landowners had to adhere to for red-cockaded woodpecker. And basically with the safe harbor agreement, if you had a family group on your land already, you still had to protect them. But if another one moved on there, and sometimes they split into two groups, that's actually how the population grows sometimes, very slow rate that way, but then you're not responsible for the other one, means that you have no obligation to protect them in any way. You could cut down all their cavity trees if you wanted to. The interesting thing to me is that as far as I know, in the Sandhills, nobody has ever done that. There are landowners that have had birds come on there, and there are even landowners now, private landowners, that try to want to put recruitment clusters and get them on their land. But even the people that were afraid their property value was going to be diminished haven't actually done anything to them. It was just the fear of that, the fear that their property wouldn't have value, they couldn't pass it on to their children, especially. And once you eliminated the fear, then they were fine with them. I'm told now that it actually increases your property value to have some on there because they're so popular now. So because these most of the places where they are, they're horse farms, and like the town of Pinehurst, which is famous for kind of having pines all over town and old pines all over town. People kind of like to have that in their yard. They like to have it along the golf courses. So it's not so much that, but just the fear. And once the fear was gone, it's really worked really extremely well. I don't think anybody anticipated it would make that much of a difference that quickly. That's whole safe harbor idea. And now it's everywhere with all kinds of species. There's even a safe harbor program out in Guam I heard about recently.
Yeah, wow.
Not for red-cockaded woodpeckers.
Yeah. We have another question asking if you found from your data anything to suggest mate selection behavior favoring the banded individuals. They've been reading that some bird species that are banded have a higher number of mates.
So another really interesting question. So we don't so much see that, but what I'm convinced I'm seeing, and I haven't done the analysis yet, is that it seems like way more often than you should, you get birds that become a breeding pair that have similar band colors. It almost looks like they're matching themselves up against based on the bands, because what we do, we have one leg has, depending on what family it's banded in, everybody banded in that family has a set of three bands, and then the aluminum band is on the other leg, and you get a different individual band. But you'll have a like dark blue, purple, dark blue bird, and then the bird that comes in there, a female from outside, is like purple, purple, dark blue. Like, really? Like, everybody's red and green over here, everybody's purple and blue over here. It just I'm going to do that analysis eventually, but I'm convinced that they are somehow like other individuals who have similar bands to them, but they all have the same number of bands, so there's none of that going on.
Interesting. Are there any other questions you can post in the chat or raise your hand? All right, and that's brought us right up to the exact hour. So I guess everyone's questions were perfectly timed. So thank you again for such an amazing presentation. It was so fascinating. What an amazing and interesting species. And thanks again to Boleyn for your awesome translation services.
It was my pleasure.
Yeah, fantastic talk, Jeff.
Thanks, Tom.